Coming up, we'll hear from Indigenous leaders, and MPs will debate the government's progress to date in meeting its promises aimed at repairing and resetting the relationship with Indigenous people in this country. But first, let's get the government's own assessment of how it's doing in meeting its commitments to Indigenous peoples. Jane Philpott is the Minister of Indigenous Services, and she joins me now in our studio. Madam Minister, good to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming in to speak with me about this important issue. As I've stated, this conversation's all about where you are as a government, where you are as a minister on this particular file, and meeting those commitments you made to Indigenous people. And I guess so much of this relates to the services the government is responsible for delivering, and that's where you come in dealing with some of these systemic and chronic failures in some of the services that the government's responsible to deliver to Indigenous people that have been a stain on the country for such a long time. So let's start there. How do you think you're doing at meeting these commitments?
Well, I think there has been encouraging progress. I mean, this is, as you've indicated, a challenge that goes back generations, has to deal with past government policies, which, to be frank, were discriminatory. It goes back to issues like residential schools, which had a huge impact by denying the rights of Indigenous peoples, trying to force assimilation of their culture, and we're paying for the results. But the Prime Minister started us off on a whole new foot. You know, he said right from the beginning there's no relationship that's more important to him or to Canadians than our relationship with Indigenous peoples. The whole reason why we have a brand new Department of Indigenous Services is so that there's an entire department focused on addressing those day-to-day quality of life issues, whether it be access to clean water, good education, jobs. Those are things that we're really focused on making a difference on.
What have you, and it's just a few months since you've assumed this new portfolio, but what have you learned as you start the job? I'm just trying to get a sense of, did you have a sense of how big the issues would be that you're dealing with when you said yes to the Prime Minister? I'll take it on.
Well, I would say that, you know, on the one hand, I've seen the enormity of the challenges, and I have visited many communities across this country, and I've heard the hurt and the pain of people whose rights have been denied, who have really not been able to enjoy the same things that the rest of Canada has been able to enjoy. But on the other hand, I've also seen a tremendous amount of hope, and I've heard people say that we have the solutions. We in our communities know what we need. If you would just give us what we have a right to, which is control of our own lives, we know how to take care of our own children, for example, and we want to implement the solutions if you'll only support us.
Let's go there. Let's talk about children. One of the key challenges you're facing right now is the crisis in child welfare in Indigenous communities. Way too many Indigenous kids being taken away from their families and placed in state foster care. People should know this. 50% of the children in care in this country are Indigenous when they make up just 8% of the Canadian population. Why is that happening?
Well, this goes back a long way. There is severe overrepresentation of Indigenous children in child care. Part of it has to do with some of the things I talked about earlier in terms of those social inequities. So tragically, children are sometimes apprehended from their families for reasons like poverty, for reasons like a house that doesn't have enough bedrooms. These are not reasons why a child should be taken away from their family, their communities, and their culture, but we've allowed it to happen. And so we had a big meeting last week. We called together First Nations, Inuit, and Métis leaders from across the country along with provincial ministers, and we've said we have to change the policies which incent the apprehension of children from their homes, and we have to find a way that we can reverse these trends, get children back into their communities, address the reasons why they are being taken away in the first place, and therefore try to prevent this from happening and reunify families.
Right. I mean, you and others, I think, have certainly Indigenous peoples have referred to their children as commodities in this system, where there's money to be made by pulling them out of their homes, and I think you've described it as a humanitarian crisis in a perverse system. Tell me about that.
Well, you know, when I've used the term the perverse incentive, which means that money flows to foster families or agencies, and many of the foster families, as you know, are non-Indigenous, according to how many kids are taken away. Well, that only means that the first inclination is often to take the children away from their home. But we've seen some good examples of where if the money is given to, whether it's an agency or a First Nations community, for example, in a block, to say, we want you to use this money to try to prevent the reasons why children might be apprehended, to support parents, to perhaps support an aunt or a grandmother to care for that child instead, because we know it's so critical for children to grow up understanding their culture, knowing who they are. We heard these heartbreaking stories of kids that had been in, up to 40 different foster homes and felt stripped of their identity, and take years later to try to rediscover who they are so that they can go forward with confidence.
So what's the plan? Is the ultimate goal to have these Indigenous communities responsible for administering and dealing with their own child welfare services? And how do you get there? Ultimately, do you think you'll have to legislate this? Will you have to order the provinces effectively out of this field if you have to?
Well, it's a great question, and you may know that our government has supported the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and one of the core rights that is internationally recognized is the right to self-determination, things like self-government. But it also pertains to sectors. So if an Indigenous nation says we would actually like to control child welfare, the well-being of children in our own nation, they have the right to do that. We need to find ways to enable that, and there are possibilities that federal legislation would facilitate the ability of a nation to claim that right. There are many nations now that are very much in a position where they would like to do that. They would like to, they're coming to me saying, the Oneida Nation in Ontario has 400 children in foster care taken out of their community. They said, would you do a pilot project with us to enable us to take control of child welfare and try to bring those kids back home, reunite them with their families, teach them their culture, and so there are some really great opportunities like that.
And are the provinces on side? I mean,
to a great extent. We've had, I think we had a fantastic meeting last week. The provinces are absolutely cognizant of the challenges that are being faced. Again, I have provincial ministers coming to me saying we're totally on board with this direction. Let's figure out how we can get there. And now we've set up tripartite or trilateral tables in every single province and territory to be able to have those conversations.
But ultimately, is your objective to be able to say, there may still be a need to put Indigenous children from communities in foster care, but that decision would be made by those communities. They would say that we've come to a point where we think it's the best decision. We're not fighting any money on it. We think it's the right idea. Is that the ultimate goal? They would make the crucial decisions about who stays and who goes out of these communities.
I don't know that we can ever generalize to what every single Indigenous community will want to do down the road, but we're saying that we're open to those conversations, and we believe there are many that are in a position where they would like to do that. As you say, to be able to make those decisions for themselves, and in some cases, there isn't absolutely no one else that can care for a child in foster care may be necessary. Or in many cases, First Nations will choose to work with a First Nations child welfare agency. That's fantastic, but they need the control, and they need to be able to prioritize the ability of those children to be raised in the culture.
The conversation we're having is all about looking down the road a couple of years and delivering on promises and deliverables. How close do you think you'll be to some new model that everybody's on board with 2 years from now?
Well, I think we will have gotten a long way there. You don't undo generations of discriminatory policies overnight. We've got an entire process, a group of ministers that are looking at a review of federal laws and policies and trying to decide what needs to change. But it's the way that I believe, under the Prime Minister's leadership, that we've been able to approach this. We call it a recognition of rights approach, meaning that we start off the conversation by saying, yes, you as Indigenous peoples have inherent Indigenous rights, you have treaty rights, we have a responsibility as a government to respect those. So what does that look like then in terms of what kind of policies we need to have? They need to be policies of equity to make sure that education funding should be equitable to what a child would get in a provincial school system, for example. And so once we start with that base of recognizing rights, it gives us the frame to be able to address all of those other social inequities.
Another big issue you're dealing with, boil water advisories. The election promise was to fix that problem in Indigenous communities within 5 years. Are you going to be able to do that?
We are firmly committed to that. The Prime Minister stood up early in 2016 and made the commitment that we will end all long-term drinking water advisories in public systems on reserve by March of 2021. And that's a big focus of my new department. We have an entire tracking system. I'm briefed on it on a weekly basis, and we have a whole team that's working on supporting communities. Again, communities have a big lead role to play in this, but we need to be there to support, making sure they have the capacity to get the system designed, get the construction equipment in place, train the water operators that are necessary so that they will have clean water, which is so essential.
As you know, I mean, other governments have taken a run at this and haven't been able to get it fixed. What is it you're doing differently? What's the different approach you think you're taking that, okay, we've made the promise, the only way to get there is by doing things differently, and this is the big thing we're doing differently?
Well, I would say there are a number of things, and I must say, of course, we're cognizant of the fact that many other governments have failed at this. One of the first things that happened, again, under Minister Bennett's leadership, was to get the funding, the long-term funding. So, people think this can happen overnight. The reality is that to design and construct a water system for a very remote community can sometimes take a couple of years to get all that work done and get it all up and tested and people trained. In the past, there was never funding for more than a year or two. So we put 5-year funding in place with a commitment for ongoing funding for the operation and maintenance of this system. We're making sure that people are getting trained over the long haul, and we're actually measuring and tracking it in a very systematic way, which again has never been done before.
Okay, let's finish. Our time's almost done. You know what Indigenous leaders are saying. They've been talking with you, and we're going to hear from them in a moment. And I think generally they appreciate the fact that there's a renewed dialogue, and there does seem to be a commitment to a renewed relationship. They're also conscious of having been here before and the desire to get action to replace words. And I think you're starting to hear more and more of that. Thank you for talking with us. We need action. We need action. What do you say to them?
Well, we first of all have, I think, really rebuilt the relationships, which is, so there was a damaged relationship between the federal government and Indigenous peoples. I think few would deny that. So coming along with that new approach and then saying, let's partner together. We will, of course, respect your rights. We want communities to be in the lead. We want to enable solutions. Tell us what your priorities are. And that's when I start to hear, well, our priorities are child welfare, our priorities are water and housing. And then we start to talk about a plan and how we're going to get there. I have regular conversations with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis leaders about what their priorities are, and each group might be a little bit different. But with each of those, we put plans in place. We're seeing schools built. We're seeing close to 10,000 houses now built or renovated on reserve across the country. So they are starting to see the change. We're seeing Jordan's principle with tens of thousands of kids getting their requests approved for access to care that weren't getting them before. So there's a very long way to go yet, but we're able to demonstrate that we have made some progress, and we're rebuilding that trusting relationship so that we can make positive change in the future.
All right, Indigenous Services Minister Jane Philpott, as always, thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me.